Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, the University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in.
Weight management tips.
Today we have something you veterans already know, but novices probably don't fully appreciate. So we're going to talk about two things that are related to each other. The first one is readiness. Readiness to train, readiness to, let's say, embark on a 24-week fat loss contest-like regimen. So the other part of this is the time, because when we think about readiness, we have to think, do you have the time? Do you have other time pressures in your life? Most of us do. But the time frame is just huge. As I mentioned, half a year. So we need to think seriously about the physics of this. At roughly 3,500 calories, almost entirely of fat, stored in a pound of adipose tissue, that's a long time. Once I wrote an article for T-Nation called 100 Workouts, and it was trying to get to this idea that it's going to take roughly 100 workouts. Let's say we want to burn fat more directly, and we're just going to walk mildly uphill on a treadmill, keep that RER, the respiratory exchange ratio, very low. That's just something on a metabolic cart that can show you that you're really leaning on fat as the fuel source. But when you look at that, it takes about 100 workouts. So that is something that I call the tortoise approach. There's also the hare approach, where you can actually do sprint work and high-intensity interval training, HIIT, and whatnot. But let's just stick with more direct fat oxidation just for sake of argument and the physics and the numbers. That's what it's going to take. So if you want to lose 10 pounds of fat, and they're 3,500 calories each, that's 35,000 calories worth of fat that you need to burn off. That's not going to happen this week or this month. And that kind of delayed gratification is very hard for people. So part of readiness is the time it takes. And it really, I think, takes an exercise physiologist to point out these enormous time frames and the amount of delayed gratification that's required for success. But let's return to the beginning of this. Tip number one, if you will. And that's the readiness. One of the ways that you can do this practically is in your workout log, literally on a 1 to 7 scale, a Likert type scale from very, very low to very, very high. Ask yourself, how ready are you to embark on, again, if we're going to assume 10 pounds for something that you can notice, and honestly, it might be 20 pounds before someone else notices, and again, hence the half a year kind of thing. But if we stick to just 10 pounds, and that being a 3 to 6 month endeavor, let's say, or 100 workouts done almost daily, let's see what goes into this number, this 1 to 7 that you're going to assign to yourself. The Mayo Clinic staff had some strategies for this. Some of these are a little obvious to me, perhaps, but some of them are quite helpful. They include things like, am I too distracted by other pressures? That's going to make your number lower, right, as far as whether or not you're ready. Distraction by other pressures. Are you starting a new job? Did you move to a new location? For a lot of people, that might not be an ideal time. Even if you're in the middle of hard training, there's some interesting data on overtraining that the added stressor could lower your overtraining threshold and drive you over the edge, if you will. So other pressures are a big deal. Another question you might ask yourself, we're focusing on more of a fat loss today. Some of this in reverse applies to weight gain in synthesizing and building muscle, and with the time frames and whatnot. But do you use food as a means to cope with stress? Something else the Mayo Clinic staff is posing to you. Do you use food in an emotional way? Or can you use it in just a very utilitarian way? I think in bodybuilding, a lot of us have just used it in a very utility kinds of way. Yeah, you'd like your food to taste good, but you can eat plain tuna and rice, on schedule and with the right dose or amount. Other things that might go into this readiness number for you. Am I ready to learn or use other strategies to cope with stress or some of these other pressures, time pressures in my life? So it might be something like Do you meditate? Should you learn how to do that? Or music, or walking outside in the park or in the wilderness? There are some things that you can do other than eat. Are you an evening eater? I know my appetite was always higher in the evening. That's true of a lot of people. What's your strategy to deal with that? You better get it in place if you're going to start, again, this regimen. That's almost daily, right? When we talk about 100 workouts, that's almost daily. Let's say 5-6 times a week for 5 months, 6 months. That's what we're talking about here. Do you need other support from family or friends? So the social aspect is big as well. If your spouse is making cheesy lasagna and breadsticks every week, deep fried foods, sugary pop, it makes it really hard. I've worked with weight management clients before where I was just kind of stunned at the lack of support from the spouse. Sometimes one of the spouses doesn't cook. It's like, I don't know, I can't diet because I don't do the cooking. Well, guess what, buddy? You learn how to at least make things like oatmeal and throw berries in it, something like that, so you can try to meet some of these short-term goals, right, and your strategies. Maybe you're the kind of person who's more of a solo lifter. We talked about this in another episode recently, or exerciser, runner, and you don't need the other support as much. I can tell you just personal perspective, when I would diet, and it would get increasingly strict as I progressively pulled carbohydrates out of my diet over about 24 weeks, about halfway through that, my diet was so different from the rest of the family, I would just sort of, eat differently. I'd make my own stuff, and my wife was cool about making stuff for my son and herself, and that's kind of how we made it work. So social support is a big one. Your eating and your activity habits. From a time perspective, you might say, well, how on earth do I just deal with time pressures? It might be something like, can you save up a little bit of money? Maybe you can pay for childcare if you're not currently doing that for the next couple of months. There's lots of time management kinds of things. There's an old adage about you don't find the time, you make the time. One of the things I always liked about the mild type walk uphill cardio, again, you got to burn through about 350 calories. So you're going to be on that treadmill for 45 to 60 minutes, depending on your body weight and the incline and the speed. But that's a kind of thing you have to think about. Maybe you do it in the morning. You don't normally get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, now maybe you do, and you go either downstairs on the elliptical in your house or a treadmill, or hopefully the gym is not too far away. If not, you could even walk outside, with a weighted backpack or something like that, enough to get your heart rate, depending on your age, let's say in that like 120 range, something like that. Elevate your heart rate somewhat and get in that sort of fat burning zone. And then the nice thing about that, the double whammy, is not only do you get your cardio out of the way, but you don't exhaust your carbohydrate stores, your glycogen stores in your muscles when it comes to your afternoon or evening workout, so you can still hit the iron hard. And the last thing is even to consider the time expenditure just to log everything, to take time writing down your progress, both the cardio aspects and the weights, and maybe even some of the dietary things, the macros. And let me add just a final consideration. When it comes to behavior change, you just don't jump into eating plain tuna and rice in smallish portions and hour on a treadmill. You start smaller. It might be as little as 20 minutes walking and not eating out, not eating any fast food or deep fried food. That's the way to begin. It is, in fact, how I would start the first month when I would do contest prep, getting very, very lean. And I was able to get down around 4% fat repeatedly over the years doing that. So starting small is good. The other thing that we already touched on is the combination of diet and exercise. When I say 100 workouts, that's if you hold your diet very fixed and steady. You can hasten all of this by cutting calories. If you find a way to remove 350 calories per day on the intake side by folding fibrous veg into your foods and that sort of thing, switching down in the fattiness of your milk, what have you, that's going to hasten it too. It's not going to cut it from 6 months to 3, but it is going to speed it all up. So even if you're advanced, there's 2 tips to remind you this week, partly from textbook and my own experience, partly from the Mayo Clinic, is readiness and what goes into that, and the large time investment. Hope that helps, and we'll see you later. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.